Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to see you all joining our webinar today. We'll wait another few seconds for people to join, but we have so much data to go through with you, so we will not wait for too long. A few housekeeping things before we jump in. Along the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A box. That is where you can send any questions that you have while we're going. That can either be about EVP's data, it can be for any of our panelists. If we have some time for audience Q&A after the main panel discussion, we will be happy to send those questions along to our panelists, but don't feel like you have to wait until then. Send that question in as soon as you have it. We are going to be using the chat to send questions to, or comments, links, things that are useful to you. So we're going to use that one-way chat to send you all information. So you'll notice you can't send things in the chat. That'll be just the Q&A box. One more thing before we get started, you'll see a CC box along the bottom of your screen. You can click that to either show or not show auto Zoom captioning. So depending on your preference, you can turn that on or off. Lastly, we are recording this webinar, so if you're already thinking about all the people you want to send it to, you will have it tomorrow in your inboxes. So have no fear, you will get that tomorrow. All right, I'll be introducing our panelists briefly in just a few moments, but first I'm going to pass it over to Nathaniel.
Thank you, Shannon. And thank you ahead of time to all of our incredible panelists. Thank you to our amazing guests. We're already at well over 100 participants, just 2 minutes in. This is going to be a really interesting hour. We are going to start with a little bit of data, though. And so I'm going to share my screen here. And anybody who has come to Environmental Voter Project events knows that I like to give you like an outline, a table of contents of what you're going to see so you know what's coming. First, you are going to experience the fastest introduction to the Environmental Voter Project in history. It's going to be like 90 seconds. Second, I'm going to go through some of our recent data on a report that we just released on this growing gender gap among climate voters. All of that, 1 and 2, should take no more than 15 minutes so that we can spend a whole lot of time with our expert panelists. And as Shannon mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Peter or I will answer them in the Q&A, or if we don't answer them, it's because we're actually holding them for Shannon to ask of the panelists. All right, let's get started. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Environmental Voter Project, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just 2 things. 1, identifying people who care about the environment who don't vote, and then 2, turning them into better voters. That's it. That's all we do. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. The reason we do this is because it turns out there are millions, literally millions of non-voting environmentalists. We identified well over 11 million who skipped the most recent presidential election. So we need to get these people to vote, and we do it with a 4-step process. Again, forgive me for how quick this overview is, but we want to get you to the panelists. The 4-step process. First, we work with data scientists to build predictive models that allow us to individually identify people who care so deeply about climate that it's their #1 priority, yet we can tell from public voter files that they're not actually voting. Step 2, once we find these people who don't need their minds changed because they already list climate as their #1 priority, they just need their behavior changed, we can just concentrate on mobilizing them to vote. We don't need to do any issue education. We don't need to try to persuade them to care about something that they don't already care about. So we work with thousands of volunteers to canvass, call, and send postcards to these voters. We do digital ads and direct mail, all with cutting-edge behavioral science that is focused on just one thing and one thing only, and that is getting people to vote. Step 3, habit reinforcement. We don't just concentrate on the big, sexy elections that happen every 2 years. We use every election, no matter how small, as an opportunity to build good voting habits. Because ultimately, step 4 is our goal, and that is to change the electorate. We want anybody running for anything in our 21 states to think, dear God, where did all these climate voters come from? Because when that happens, boy, does it become easier for our allies to spend their political capital on leading on climate. And boy, does it become harder for those of us who oppose leading on climate to win elections. We measure our results by submitting them to randomized control trials. I'm not going to bore you with details on what they are, but in short, that allows us to isolate what our sole impact is on climate while controlling for all other variables, while controlling for presidential campaigns and Senate campaigns. This is how we can tell that were it not for the Environmental Voter Project, which people wouldn't have voted. And just looking at the last 4 years in randomized control trials, we've found dozens of elections where our experiments have shown that we were solely responsible for boosting turnout of these first-time environmental voters at what's called a statistically significant amount, which means it was not due to random occurrence. And in 2021, in 22, in 23, in 24, we have found that we increased turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in presidential general elections, 3.8 percentage points in other statewide elections, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. We have the receipts. We're getting proven results at a time when what the climate movement needs more than anything is more political power. Over the long term, we have now communicated with almost 12.8 million unique individual voters, all of whom, by definition, were pretty crappy voters, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them. And as we could see from public voter files, about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago was the last time we measured this, almost 2.2 million of them have now become consistent voters who had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. This is our ultimate goal at EVP. All right, that's it. That's all I'm going to tell you about the Environmental Voter Project. If you want more information about our work, the link will be in the chat. Now let's get to some of this data that came out in our recent Green Gender Gap report, and then we can get to the expert panel. First, some words on our methodology and terminology. We are working with data from 21 states. Why these 21 states? Well, these are the 21 states where the Environmental Voter Project works. And because we're focused on identifying people who care about climate and the environment, and then mobilizing the ones who need mobilization to vote, well, we spend a lot of time and money in these 21 states and not in the other 29 states. So this data is from these 21 states. When I am going to be referencing climate voters or environmental voters, what that means in this context is these are people who don't just care about climate and the environment, but are very, very likely to list it as their #1 priority over all other issues. And what I mean by very, very likely is in our predictive models, they have at least an 85% likelihood of, again, not just caring about climate, but literally listing it as their #1 priority. When we use race and ethnicity terminology, we are using the terminology that is in Target Smart voter files. And then finally, very important for this discussion in particular, voter files have sex data, not gender data. A lot of this data is collected by state entities. Some of it is self-identified by the voter, some of it is identified by the state, some of it is modeled, some of it is taken from outside private information. So just please know, oftentimes we are going to use the overarching term gender. What we are actually meaning in this context is sex. Obviously the two are different, but that is not information that you can discern in voter files. All right. Let's jump into some of our report's findings and then get into our panel discussion. If you look at the baseline level of registered voters in these states, there is a 5.1 percentage point gender gap. That means there are more women registered to vote than there are men in these states, but not a lot. It's a 5-point gender gap. When you look at the voters we've identified who are likely to list climate as their #1 priority, it's a 25-point gender gap. It is enormous. So something real is going on here. And that's why we think it's really important to talk to people who know these communities and know organizing in these communities and have lived a lot of the research. We see this consistently across all 21 states that we studied. In Nevada, it had the smallest gap. It was 21 percentage points. In Georgia, it was the largest, 29 percentage points. But still, that's pretty darn consistent across all of those states. So this isn't being driven by one geography. Also, this is not a new thing. Now, EVP has not been around for a long time, but we do have 4 data points over the past 6 years. And as you'll see, this gender gap among climate voters has been pretty big for a while, but boy, did it get much, much larger recently. Now, I think it's important to have a baseline for this data that you're looking at. And chances are, like me, many of you heard about the gender gap last fall, about this widening gender gap around presidential vote choice. And so at first we looked at this data and we thought, well, this is interesting, but maybe it's just the same thing that we're seeing in other political contexts where there is this growing gender gap. But the truth is, this is very different from the gender gaps we see elsewhere in politics. When you look at the presidential choice gender gap, so presidential vote choice gender gap, it's actually much smaller and there's much less variability. So what do I mean by that? I mean, we at EVP obviously only have data in these states going back to 2019, but you can go back 30 years. You can go back to the 1996 election, presidential election, and every single presidential election since 1996, the vote choice gender gap has been between 7 and 13 points. What does that mean? It means at its smallest, women were 7 percentage points more likely than men to choose the Democratic candidate over the past 30 years. At its largest, the gender gap expanded to 13 points. For those of you who are curious, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were right in the middle of that. Kamala Harris won women by 10 percentage points. It was right in the middle of a pretty stable and significantly smaller gender gap than what we're seeing among climate voters. And so I'm not going to pretend that we know what's going on here, but it's not as simple as, oh, women care much, much more about climate and the environment because in general, they are more likely to be progressive in political choices. Maybe that's some of what's going on here, but it certainly doesn't explain all of it. Similarly, this gender gap is consistent among climate voters in all age groups. But whoo boy, is it really dramatic among the youngest voters. Now again, we want to provide a relevant baseline. So look at these pink data points here. That is the female advantage over male voters when you're just looking at registered voters, because there are more women registered to vote than men in every age group. So it's important to understand that there's going to be a gender gap pretty much whenever you look at voters. But look at how just enormous it is among young people. This is something that is mirrored in politics at large. I'm sure you don't need me to tell any of you out there that young men are rapidly getting conservative, and young women are almost as rapidly getting more progressive. And boy, are we seeing that in this data. When we look at the distribution of all climate voters, which is what you see at the top, and compare it to the distribution of all registered voters, what are a few trends that we're seeing? Well, first, there's a lot more green at the top than at the bottom, right? That's because there are many more women who make up climate voters than there are women who make up all registered voters. But look, in particular, there are some groupings that are disproportionately large. That's women 35 to 49. I'm sorry, women 25 to 34, women 35 to 49, and women 65 and older. I want to be clear, what I'm about to say is conjecture. It is not something we have hard data on. It is possible that there's something going on among women who have children in the home or are grandmothers. Do we know that for sure? No, that data is not in voter files. But what we do know is that these age groups, 25 to 34, 35 to 49, and 65 and up, are, according to the census, the ones that are most likely to have children in the home or be grandmothers. Do we know that that's related to what's going on here? No. But boy, does it stand out that these are the age groups that see the disproportionately largest populations among climate voters. Okay, almost done here. When we look at the racial breakdown of gender gaps, the gender gap is largest among Black voters, but it's not as simple as just saying that, because we also need to bear in mind that the underlying gender gap among all Black registered voters is also enormous. It's enormous. And data like this tells a story. When you see that, forget climate voters, when you just look at registered voters and you see that Black women outnumber Black men among registered voters, it tells you how many Black men we are putting in prison, and it tells you how many Black men are dying or being killed in the United States. That's why there's this enormous gender gap in the underlying baseline of registered voters. Even so, when we look at climate voters, it is just dramatic. But when we look at Native American voters, that's where the gender gap is most, I guess, abnormally large when compared to the underlying gender gap among registered voters. All right, looking at this data, from what we can tell, and certainly more things might come out in the discussion, there are three things that might merit some further study that we think are really interesting. First, this thing that I brought up about whether motherhood and grandmotherhood might be driving deeper climate concern. We don't know that, but some of this data might hint towards that. Second, why does the green gender gap seem to be so much bigger and so much more volatile than vote choice gender gaps? And then third, just overall, there has been so much research showing that the climate crisis is not gender neutral. Women disproportionately bear the burden of climate impacts. Might gender inequality be driving some of this disproportionate concern among women for the climate crisis? Again, we don't know. All we know is that this gender gap is dramatic, and it is so much bigger than the gender gaps we're seeing in other political arenas. So we thought it was important to call that out. All right, if you would like more information, you can find all of our reports at environmentalvoter.org, and we will share the link to this report in particular in the chat. That's all I've got. I am going to hand it over to Shannon and our incredible panelists.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. So first, I will introduce myself. My name is Shannon Siegel. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the organizing and field director at the Environmental Voter Project. So I'm very lucky to work with the whole Environmental Voter Project team, both on things like this data, as well as mobilizing these environmental voters with many of you, our volunteers who are on this call, and other folks who are interested in our work. All right, for the next bit of time, I'm briefly going to introduce our panelists, but I would love each of our panelists to introduce yourself a little bit more, and then we'll dive into questions. So with us today, we have Dominique Browning, who is the founder of Moms Clean Air Force, an amazing organization if folks are not yet familiar. We have Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who, among many, many titles, is a marine biologist, a writer, a policy expert. You might have heard of her book, All We Can Save, or What If We Get It Right? And she's also a member of our board of advisors, so we're very lucky here at EVP. And Camila Thorndike, who was the climate engagement director for the Harris for President campaign, as well as the former climate, energy, and environmental advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders. So I am so delighted to be here with these three panelists today. I'd love to pass it to reverse order. We'll do Camila, Ayana, and then Dominique. If you'd like to tell us for about a minute about the work that you do.
Thanks, Shannon. It's such an honor to be on this panel. I am a mega fan of both Dominique and Ayana, and of EVP because honestly, this is like shocking data. I'm really excited to get into it. I have a lifelong background in clean energy and climate justice organizing. I think of myself as an organizer first and foremost, and have been mainly outside of government, pushing lawmakers to take action across the country and at the federal level, with a short stint in the Senate, as you mentioned, and then had the honor of serving on the Harris Walz campaign and currently work in climate philanthropy.
Thank you, Camila. I'll pass it to Ayana.
I am qualified to be here because I am an EVP super fan from like literally day one. My claim to fame is I was the first donation to the like crowdfunding thing that Nathaniel didn't personally know. I will brag about that for the rest of my life. Back when I had a Facebook account, I was like, ooh, what's this? This looks like an incredibly smart thing that someone should be doing. And I have no money because I'm right out of grad school, but you can have it all. And so I've been cheering them on in many ways ever since. I'm a scientist, I'm a writer, I'm a teacher at Bowdoin College. I teach climate communications, which has been an absolute blast. And I also co-founded and helped to lead Urban Ocean Lab, which is a policy think tank for the future of coastal cities and climate adaptation. I think that's probably enough.
And we'll keep getting into more. All right, Dominique.
Okay, hi. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Dominique Browning, and I run Moms Clean Air Force, which I founded with a group of other mothers I started thinking about it about 15 years ago. And I can tell you more about that, or should I just dive in?
Yeah, feel free to tell us just a little bit more about it.
Okay, sure. Moms is a group of about 1.5 million members. We are across the country, and we organized in order to harness all this mother power that I was seeing online. It's hard to even believe it was only 15 years ago that blogging was a new thing, and that there was a whole group of bloggers who referred to themselves as mommy bloggers. And I started looking at what they were writing about, and it was a lot of issues, kind of like what we're seeing today too. Issues of concern about toxicity, chemicals, plastics, climate to some extent, but not that much, and some air. And I thought, well, how do we harness all this energy, this mommy blogging energy, which was pretty much targeted at what can I buy? How can we find solutions for ourselves at home? And we know that we need big system changes, right, in the climate world to make a difference. And so I thought, how can we harness all that energy towards big system impacts? And that's how Moms was founded.
That's amazing. And I think, and I'll value it to Ayana here. So with All We Can Save, I know you interviewed and read works from so many different women across the movement. I think some of whom would say like climate's their driving issue, but others, sort of like what Dominique is saying, might have said clean air or water or health was their driving issue, bringing them to this. Like, were there any central themes though that you identified with some of that work with All We Can Save?
So All We Can Save, I actually pulled it up because I was like, maybe I can quote from my own book if I like don't remember an answer. I co-edited this with Catherine Wilkinson. It's an anthology that includes writing from about 40 women who are leading on climate in all sorts of different ways. And the goal of it was to provide an example of like, look at all these amazing people doing work that matters in so many different ways, from science to policy to community organizing to poetry to indigenous rights to youth organizing to you name it, journalism, etc. Finance, I'm looking at this list now, government folks, many names you'd probably recognize. And honestly, we created this just because what we were seeing in the climate literature, in the people who were always chosen to represent like the climate leaders, were mostly white men. And we knew that that was not actually representative of who was leading. And so we thought, well, Catherine had this idea that like we could, if we made a book of a sampling of the people who were doing incredible work, then no one would be able to believe that anymore. And so we worked really, really hard to make it a bestseller, in part for that purpose, to prove that there's interest in the work of this diverse in every sense of the word collective, and also to serve as sort of a welcome, because we knew there was this untapped potential of more and more people who would want to be part of climate work, but maybe weren't sure where they fit in or hadn't really seen themselves reflected in it. So we were trying to meet that perceived need as well. And I learned so much helping to put this book together. And one of them is like, it's really challenging to do this work if you have kids at an age where they need a lot of attention. And so as we were putting it together, some of the people who had children were like, I can't make this deadline. Or some of the people who, didn't have a support staff at their nonprofit couldn't really participate in the way they wanted to. So it's so important to figure out like what is the community around leaders that makes all the work possible too.
Absolutely. And I think, Dominique, you're probably very well positioned to speak to that a bit. As Nathaniel mentioned in the report, we see that women aged 25 to 49 and 65 and older do collectively make up almost half of all of the climate voters that we identify. And, we're speculating maybe that has to do with having young children or young grandchildren. Are there some ways that you think mothers and grandmothers specifically are uniquely positioned to be leaders in the space?
Well, I really love what Ayana said about where do we fit in and showing people a way in. How can we participate? At the beginning, when we started Moms, we talked a lot about nap time activism. How can we offer people ways to engage that don't take a lot of time, that don't ask people to leave home or even get arrested? How can their voices make a difference? And we do a lot of petitioning, a lot of calls to lawmakers, calls to EPA, testimony. So for people who have super busy households, we really try to think about how can we get people in short bursts of activism, because it does matter. Every time you testify, your testimony goes into the record. Every phone call you make, every petition you sign, it really matters. At the other end are people like me. I'm a grandmother now, and that has really profoundly honed my, I don't want to say desperation, but my sense of urgency about this issue, because I think all the time about the world that our cohort, will be leaving behind. And also, what are we modeling for our children and for our grandchildren? And my grandson actually loves to talk to me about Mom's Clean Air Force. He thinks it's really cool that people are trying to protect the planet. And I love that.
And it was cool. That's why your grandson thinks so. That makes a lot of sense. That's something we think about a lot at EVP too. For a while, we didn't have too many opportunities for folks who had that kind of busier household schedule, who maybe couldn't volunteer within, 9 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. And that's something like I have really thought about as the organizing and field director here at EVP are, we don't want to have opportunities that are a waste of someone's time, right? You have limited time. We want it to be an important use of your time and also work for your schedule and for your how your household works. So that's why we have things like postcarding. And we've interestingly, like this was unexpected, had a lot of mothers canvassing and bringing their kids with them to canvas. It's like, well, we're going to go for a walk anyway. How about we talk to some of our neighbors while we're doing it? So I really resonate with the things that you're bringing up there, Dominique. Camila, as someone on the younger age of that spectrum, like myself, and you've spoken publicly about how climate change is a real factor in your own thoughts about having kids. Do you think that this aspect, just like having to even think about that, is part of why there are so many younger climate women voters compared to men?
Yes, I think it's invariably part of the equation here, and I have spoken about it since 2016 when I testified to the DNC platform drafting committee and included this climate anxiety in my testimony, and then was really pleased to see AOC speak out about it in 2019. She was basically pointing out that there's this scientific consensus that the lives of our children are going to be very difficult if we don't take radical action, or not so radically framed action, very common sense, if you ask me. And so it leads young people to have a really legitimate question about having kids. And I've been in the Washington Post and then across right-wing media throughout the campaign on this question, because obviously it strikes a chord. I mean, what more central dilemma for a society, a people, a culture than the fact of the future and generations that will come. And the publication I'm proudest of having been quoted in actually is a book called The Conceivable Future: Planning Families and Taking Action in the Age of Climate Change by Megan Kallman and Josephine Ferraroli, who are incredible activists and academics, and have organized these salons, first for climate activists over a decade ago, and then now for more and more people who have wrestled with this question. And I think they frame it in the most important way, which is that this is an important question facing individuals, but it is not an individual problem or solution. Like, this is not something to explain away as whether you're going to, use your uterus for a certain purpose or not, but it's a political question of how we structure our societies and whether we're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, for instance. And so because girls and women are still socialized across many cultures within this country and across the world, to see, our most important job is having kids and getting married and that sort of frame. I don't think the expectation is foisted on men and boys in the same way, but it affects everyone. And as someone now partnered with an incredible dad to 3 young girls, ages 10, 12, and 14, I know that it's not something that men necessarily care less about, but that we need to change the cultural frame around this. And that's the discussion I think that we're having today.
Absolutely. And that really gets at one of my next questions for Dominique, which is, at Moms Clean Air Force, you all are super clear, like, this is not exclusive to moms. It's not exclusive to grandmothers, parents, caregivers. Anyone in the space is really welcome to participate, which is amazing. And I think getting at what Camila's noting, why did you all choose to call it Moms Clean Air Force?
Well, that goes back to those mommy bloggers, right? And harnessing and kind of amplifying that concern, that maternal lioness love, if you will. Of course, as the mother of 2 boys, 2 sons, I I would never say that men don't care as much. Although the big glaring question here is, where are the men? Why is there such a huge gap? I cannot for the life of me understand that. I do want to remind all of us that 15 years ago, we were tearing our hair out about nobody cared about climate. And it wasn't even a question during debates. And people certainly weren't voting on it. And so we've made progress. But I don't know, I can't really explain why there is such a huge gap. The thing is, there's a historical precedent of women being community leaders in communities all across the country, and especially justice leaders, women standing up for their neighborhoods, women fighting polluters, women who are having to take care of children. You mentioned the adverse impacts that are disproportionately felt and carried by women still. And that's another reason. Who's going to the emergency room with a child having an asthma attack? So these things fall on women's shoulders more often than, or rather, women step up to these challenges more often than men do. And that seems to be of a piece. And now we are in such a weird time warp in terms of what women are expected and not expected to do, that who knows what these polls are going to look like at the end of another year.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
would
Ayana.
add, so I think I didn't fully answer your question on the first round, and hearing what Dominique was saying, it sort of reminded me when Catherine and I were sort of thinking about how to introduce the anthology and what sort of threads we were seeing through the writing of all these different women. It was this sense of like compassion, connection, creativity, and collaboration. We identified like a few more specific characteristics of this feminine leadership we were observing, which of course, like anyone can exhibit these traits, but that there's a clear focus on making change as opposed to being in charge. It's like, okay, but like, let's get the thing accomplished. The second one was this commitment to responding to the climate crisis in ways that heal systemic injustices rather than deepen them. So as Camila kind of opened with her own commitment to climate justice throughout her career, I think that we were seeing that come through much more prominently across the board. Also this appreciation for heart-centered and not just head-centered leadership. And it's been truly amazing to see the ways these things show up also in the youth climate movement, which is majority girls leading all that work. If you look at the demographics of a youth climate march, it's like teenage girls who are just like, do not mess with my future. And like, it's breaking my heart that you don't care. And the fourth thing that we mentioned was the recognition that building community is required for building a better world, that this, like, we're really all in this together in this inextricably intertwined way. And of course, these aren't like feminine only traits, but these were the things that were rising to the top as notable in across the board in ways that women were leading, which was really beautiful to see.
Yeah, Shannon, I don't know if
Camila,
you're going to get to this question about the campaign, but I wanted to
jump
directly.
in. This is perfect.
Yeah, I just love what Ayana just summarized, and I loved All We Can Save so much. Because this emphasis on getting it done versus being in charge, I do think is quite central to the cultural difference of not necessarily women or girls in charge, but a more feminine way of problem solving. And on the campaign, the people who did the bulk of the hard work, who did not want to or need to be visible, were women. it so happens that my two primary right hands were young men, and they kicked ass, and I love them to death. But you know, they were like hired and more in many ways more visible. The number of women who came forward and said, "Look, you know, please don't like put me on anything here. I really don't need to be in the spotlight, but like I could call at any hour of the 24-hour clock." And I won't even name them here because they probably still want to stay behind the scenes, but they really moved mountains. And of the 200 people who are just our little climate team deployed to battleground states to work so hard for the last few weeks of the campaign, you know, the vast majority of those were indeed women. And I think, you know, the last thing I'll say about the election, and it is around this age gap that Nathaniel was pointing out, because my question from like a political science lens is how much climate has been obviously painted as a progressive issue, even though it is not, right? Clean energy should be and is being rolled out in so many red states. But that the gender gap, you know, has never been this high in a partisan sense. It's doubled in the last 25 years. And so how do we, yes, square the circle here on the clean energy economy that is fed by climate policies, still being predominantly, you know, 60% white men in many of these jobs as we currently classify them. I would say the climate economy is much broader than just clean energy. But the beneficiaries of these policies still aren't necessarily the people or communities who are fighting for them the hardest. And I think a lot of that is unfortunately going to need to be solved again, because the Build Back Better Act that led to the Inflation Reduction Act, that obviously is now being torn to shreds in many ways, but it did not include the care economy part of the equation that was so central to the holistic climate justice vision.
Shannon, sorry to derail this a tiny bit further, but Dominique, I'm curious if this resonates with you, because when I see volunteer positions like in a campaign office, a field office, you know, in Georgia, it's like all women, like all women. And I think it's maybe even more notable in volunteer positions, Camila, than in like paid positions. It's like, who is showing up not only for no recognition, but for no money? They're just like, this is the thing that just someone has to do. And in those field offices that I was seeing in the South and elsewhere, it was like much older women too. And you know, that gender gap that Nathaniel showed us by race, it was like in Georgia, it's like Black women in their like 65 plus who are just running all these offices and like making sure everyone had snacks and clipboards and whatever.
You know, I mean, it comes back to those words you were saying, community and caring, and that's what we see over and over and over again. People coming out of their communities and into our larger community. We have meetings every week with our field organizers, and they are like my favorite moment in the week, because we feed off of each other's lessons and wins, and we support one another, and people are giving each other tips about what to do. And I can see how inspiring and how much support we get from one another by collaborating and by finding communities, not only your community of people you're caring for in your local area, but the broader community of those of us who are voting climate and trying to push policy. And that's the other thing. You know, at Moms, we're policy oriented and we're very science based. You know, everything is as accurate as it can possibly be, even though we do lead with our hearts. And I talk often about the power of love as a political power, and it is an incredibly important power. But all of it is based in science, and that is especially important to hold on to right now, as we are seeing a reversal completely of of any understanding of a scientific consensus. But, you know, I want to just stay for a moment on Camilla's point about having children. That is such a deep and profound human impulse and human concern. And I think it probably gets to the heart of the climate voter. And in the same way, in my generation, we worried about nuclear war, and we worried about why would I bring children into a world where bombs might drop and everybody will be obliterated. And I think that sense of deep and profound dread and terror makes you wake up to what's going on. You know, we're ringing alarm bells all the time, and this gender gap is frustrating to me because I'm just like, well, why isn't everybody concerned as we are? So, you know, it doesn't get deeper an alarm bell than I'm not sure I want to bring children into this world. That's so profound.
Yeah. I think that just as you're noting, Dominique, like that really feels like it's at the core of this, whether we're thinking about this as like literally biologically your own children or children you're raising, or just thinking forward, right? Like the next generation of people, whether I'm related to them or not. You know, most of us are in this work not necessarily because of the impacts on ourselves. And I think that's exactly what you're mentioning, Ayana, when you're like talking about these women showing up at field offices and just being like, I'm going to get something done. I am here and I'm going to get something done. And I'm going to make sure that everyone like has a granola bar in their pocket and a bottle of water. You know, we're like making sure that the movement stays sustainable for people to be able to keep doing it long term. Because like, as you've noted, Dominique, this isn't, I'm not going to fix this in the next 4 years. Like you've been doing this for 15 years and we're going to keep doing it. Right. So
there's great point
yeah.
on this too, that of all the different reasons that people would work on climate, love is the number one reason. That love for future generations is the number one motivator for people to really commit themselves to climate work, more than like green jobs or stronger economy. And at first I was like, I've always been kind of annoyed with that. Like, why are we talking about this as for future generations? Like, it's happening now.
Right.
Like, this is affecting us now. And like, we have to work on this now. And I thought the future generations thing was like another way of saying, like, we'll get to this. But truly, it is like polling shows it so strongly that love in general and love for future generations in particular is like what gets us to do this tricky stuff that's like not easily like something you can easily win and declare a victory on, but it's just a gnarly long-term challenge.
And one of the wonderful tensions, love, this abstract, very heartfelt, we feel it concept. But at the same time, I like to think of myself and my colleagues as pragmatic warriors. We are fighting, but we want to get things done. We have solutions. The solutions are at hand. We know what to do. We just have to get it done. And that's kind of what our lives are like every single day. We just like get stuff done by the end of the day and start again the next day. So I really like that tension of being a pragmatic warrior motivated by love.
Amen. And one final note on that, perhaps, is that love is the antidote to ego and greed, which are fundamentally the root of all of this mess, right? Like the greed of the fossil fuel industry, the ego of people who want to put themselves in the limelight for above future generations or their neighbors. And it also shows up in how we are activists and how we are organizing with each other, because the people who get the most done are driven by love, not necessarily by credit or claim, right?
There's a question in the Q&A asking sort of like, well, how do we engage men? And I don't know is the short answer, but a longer answer is As a teacher now, I look at my students and see what motivates them. And there's the thing that I'm most drawn to in any person is I love a problem solver. Like if you are a complainer, I'm not interested. I mean, everyone gets to do that, but if that's where you stop, like we're not going to be best friends. But if you're like, okay, so I've hit this challenge, what do we do? And there's this problem solving energy that some of the, teenage boys that I teach are like really excited about the problem solving of it. And I think that's something really beautiful to nurture. And that's different than just like an obsession with technology, which also tends to be more masculine kind of energy in this space, is just like fusion and solar radiation management, and just like skipping to the most the farther out there tech solutions. And so that I think is like almost like a solution neutral just mindset that we can encourage in everyone, as like, this is the craziest puzzle humanity has ever had to try to solve. Like, can you help us solve this? That tends to go over well. And then you're like a hero. So there's a little bit of appealing to the ego. But, I think we're at a sort of a by any means necessary. So I don't mind a little bit of ego stoking if that gets us there, and giving away the credit, etc.
Yeah, I think, and that, Ayana, you're perfectly reading so many of the questions. So for folks that aren't seeing, we've had a number of people ask, like, not only where are the men, like, where are they? If you're here in the call, please make sure you're showing up to all these things that these folks are talking about. But like, how do we continue to like foster men in the movement? And I would put the caveat as well of like, not just in the like technocratic way of like, how do we like find a technological solution, because we've got a lot of technological solutions, like how do we get them done? So I'd love, Camila, Dominique, do you have any thoughts on, like either where are the men, or like how do we get them into this sort of love driven part of the movement?
One question that came up for me is how a climate voter is categorized. And I know that, the simple words climate change or even clean air, clean water are both straightforward, but really kind of not, in the sense that also we're missing much of the climate problem solving space, to Ayana's point, where issues of economic prosperity, cutting costs, if like inflation was like the number one, or at least costs writ large were such a pressing concern for voters in the last cycle, it was not climate change. This was not a climate election. And I think there's actually something really important to take away there, that there is no mandate against action, and anyone who tells you that is spinning a lie. As the climate director on the campaign, let me tell you how little airtime I was given, right? And for decent reasons. If we're not, the top concern in the electorate, you got to speak to people where they're at. But it also meant that there was not a backlash to climate action through this election, right? This was not 2016. This was not like a climate year at the polls. And so if the movement has shifted towards green jobs in a really material way, as embodied through the Inflation Reduction Act, and yet we did not have that money going out the door, right? It was slow. The law took a long time to pass. There are administrative concerns from the federal down to the state, down to the local level, et cetera, et cetera. We could not point to climate as a winning issue from maybe a more masculine, provider point of view, which I think is actually central to how we move forward, is it continuing to expand the notion of a good life, and of being able to make a good living and provide for yourself, your family, your community, and gain that stature, right? Like that's always going to be part of human nature, and it has to be possible through climate action, and we know it is. It's the most likely path to prosperity, but how we can not only message but actually point to real world success stories, I think will be part of bridging the gender gap.
My mother just bombed the Zoom here a little bit, and I mentioned that because, well, she just walks into my office whenever she wants. I think part of it is like how we're raised. I was raised to revere nature and to respect my role as like one person in this greater web of life. I think a lot of it goes to also like what values we're instilling in our children, not just for girls, but for boys as well. And I remember there's a scientific study that like made me gasp when I read that men typically thought it was like too girly to carry a reusable shopping bag to the grocery store, so they wouldn't do it. And I was like, if that's where we're at, oh my gosh, how are we going to get anything done? And of course, there's like lots of ways around that, and I'm not sure how different the polling might be now. That was quite a number of years ago. But as Camila was saying, I mean, so many of the clean energy jobs are in like typically male professions. And so there are these ways that people are providing for their families through really important green jobs. And so I think it was one of those things where, you know, the longer the programs and funding from the Inflation Reduction Act is able to stick around until those benefits are really obvious to people, so that they're seeing these battery manufacturing and solar installations built and providing really good jobs in communities. I mean, one of the things that I sort of think about a lot is the fact that Iowa and Texas have the most clean energy in the country. And it's not because it's a bunch of like girly people making all the decisions about what kind of energy we have. It's like good jobs, and it like makes economic sense. So I think we're at the point where some of that stuff, some of those sort of perceptions become less important when people are like, oh, I could just make a bunch of money doing this. Cool, I'm in.
That's my system. Yeah, and you know, we're talking about voters, right? But the environmental organizations are full of men who passionately care and you know, have their own issues with how women might be approaching things. But that's another conversation. And you know, so it's not like the men are absent from the work. And I think it's important not to demonize either, you know, and to really, to me, one of the saddest things that happened in the environmental movement was the phrase "kill coal," because generations of coal miners gave their lives and their children's lives and died of diseases so that we could have electricity across this country in the most rural areas possible. And it was really within living memory in places like Texas. So, you know, if we could bring some of that love into the narrative of energy and understand, you know, there's always been energy transitions, and nobody is like trying to kill people. There's definitely a lot of greed and cynicism. I have no doubt about that. But I think it's important not to move into demonizing what people have done, and honoring that, having kind of a truth and reconciliation process in a way, which maybe would bring more people along. I don't know.
Yeah, I think what you all really seem to be speaking to is obviously this data is very surprising. It's shocking. It's stark. There's trends going on here. Why are there so many more women climate voters than men? And when we broaden it out, how can we make sure that climate leadership is intersectional and interdisciplinary? Like, how can we make sure there's climate leadership for people who think the economy is the number one issue, people who think immigration is the number one issue? Like, we all on this call are probably very aware of all the ways that we can tie these pieces together. So maybe part of the issue is, how do we get more men to say climate's their number one issue? And how do we make sure that climate is a forefront of all these other issues on leadership? All right, we have like a minute left. I want to make sure each of our panelists has a sentence or two. What should we all be doing in 2025? How can we move forward from here?
Okay, go
I'll
ahead.
start. Someone asked in the chat if I were to add a chapter to my book, what if we get it right now? What would it focus on? And two things, I would add two chapters. One on sustainable fashion, because there's huge impacts of fashion on environment and climate, and it's like a massive cultural issue. And the other is voting. I included a lot on policy, but I would have interviewed Nathaniel, to be honest, if I'd been able to add another chapter. And instead, he was the first stop of my book tour, was interviewing him. And the thing I would say I'd encourage people to do right now is to really think about how you can get involved locally. Your city councils, your town councils are making a ton of decisions about how climate policy is implemented. And that's a level of government at which you can be really influential because there's just fewer people involved. So my mother, who just walked in, moved in with me a few months ago and started going to the town council meetings about like where we should put more housing and land use planning and zoning. And she's like, where are we putting the wildlife corridors? Do we have enough fresh water for all this more construction? And just asking the questions. And of course, volunteer with Environmental Voter Project constantly. Read all their emails and sign up for lots of shifts.
Amen. Yes. I will say there's an incredibly important thing to do that is not local in 2025. We are facing an EPA that is going to try to undo the endangerment finding, which is the foundational the foundation of all of EPA's climate work, all of EPA's efforts to rein in climate emissions. That is going to be a huge battle. It really matters for everybody to tell EPA how against this you are. So that's a really big fight that we have to fight. And then the other thing I just want to put on everybody's radar, and that has to do with plastics and petrochemical and toxicity of chemicals. It is really, the more I read, the more we learn, the more work we do, the more shocking it becomes. And that is something that we all need to become much more aware of and much more demanding of change in everywhere, from our stores, the manufacturers, to the laws.
I have nothing to add in terms of specific actions or targets for people's work, because I think those are such important calls to action. I just want to underscore them. And I'll say, in how you do that matters. Make a commitment and show up regularly. Do not underestimate the radical value of showing up. And that includes getting off social media. That's fine. Like, do your however many minutes a day, but limit it. Get in relationship with the people in your community, whatever that means. If it's your neighborhood, your city hall, the national organization that you organize with over Zoom, we need to actually do the work, which is not clicking and sharing and liking so much as the messiness of human change, which means consistently showing up, even when it's hard. And in doing so, will dissolve the cynicism that the powers of be want us to be stopped by. Anytime you feel cynical, remember someone's making a lot of money off of making you feel that way.
So there we come full circle, right? Get in relationship with people.
Oh, well, I think those are our perfect parting words. Thank you, Camila. Thank you, Ayana. Thank you, Dominique. And
Oh, I think Shannon made it all the way to the end before having technical difficulties. Thank
thank
you,
you all.
everybody. And thank you, Shannon. Have a good night, folks. Bye.